This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and this is show number 16. Before we start today's show, remember that the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. Well, we're to another show. It's Thursday. I know some of you are driving, so I would really advise you to be very safe and conscious out there of what's going on around you. I want to share with you something that came to my attention in the paper over this past weekend. It's in the Sunday edition of the Savannah Morning News, and that's for July 23rd. It's in the viewpoint section, and it really speaks to why I think it's so important for us to dig a little deeper and look a little closer at this whole concept of why we need truth, reconciliation, healing in order to move towards justice. So some of you may have seen this, but in the viewpoint section, it shows a picture of 3 young boys, and the caption reads, "Violent Crime and Lost Boys of Savannah." And the article is entitled, "We know what we should do to help kids have better futures, so why don't we?" So these 3 youth that are pictured on this picture are actually sitting behind crime scene tape from a crime scene that they were sitting at, looking at a dead body. I know this is pretty graphic, so prepare yourself. Now, fortunately, they don't have the dead body in the picture, but it goes back to this picture was taken in 2000, where they lived in a housing project in Savannah. And I'm still getting all, acclimated to some of the things that happened in Savannah from the time that I didn't live here. And it appears that this particular housing project has since been closed down, but what I'm getting to is that it didn't cure the problem. So this article goes on to read, fast forward, you look at these kids and they, the very fact that they're witnessing this. Fast forward as they become adults, 2 of them have already been indicted for murder. And the other has been accused of possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. So in other words, all of their lives basically took on the path of really destruction as far as being a positive influence in our community, which gets back to what I've mentioned in the previous show from the question that we need to ask ourselves is, are all the children doing well? And this article goes on to state, what are some of the things that we should be doing. And it talks about supporting better schools, volunteering as adults, being mentors. It talks about backing efforts like the Summer 500 program here in Savannah. It talks about supporting the political leaders that are looking at very progressive agendas and addressing the problem. And so it goes on to say that, this is a systemic problem, and it's really something that it's not only unique to Savannah, it's all across our nation. And so I want you to think in terms of maybe it's time that we take a closer look at why we need to go through this process of looking at our history truthfully to go through reconciliation so that we can get to healing and to get to the type of justice that's not going to continue to address systemic issues. So the way I look at this, and it was a great article, and it had some very positive things about what was going on in the city, and it's sad that this is looking at, from generation to generation that this continues. And so I encourage you to think of what I view as a systemic problem with racism and privilege. It's like having inflammation. So those of you that have dealt with inflammation or dealing with inflammation, and the medical science with it now, basically stating that it's in some cases chronic because you had or it's not going to be long term because you had an injury, but in some cases it's chronic, and it is the core of many of the diseases that we deal with now, whether it's diabetes, whether it's arthritis, even Alzheimer's has been identified as having its root in inflammation. So I look at this issue as an inflammatory issue. And we are going to have a guest on today's show, and she's going to talk about her journey through Savannah, going to school here, and some of the current initiatives that she has been involved in to really start looking at the truth of our history and doing it and telling the story in such a way that it's engaging. But it's also important for us to remember that we have to look at what's going on with ourselves internally. And that to me was the hardest part for me, because I really was very resistant. And this was in 2012. So, this was not, me being a teenager or young adult or in my 20s or 30s. This was 2012 when I had my moment of being invited to go to a race reconciliation workshop and being very resistant. I didn't want to go. And when I went, I realized that part of the resistance was I didn't really want to deal with the things that growing up and being aware of and being identified as the other and having that constant pressure of doing better, doing more, or, that trying to achieve that next level, and realizing that, okay, so where are we now? And it's 2017 and we still have the same issues. I see hope because people are addressing this issue in their community, to realize that we can't just erase our history, that we really have to look at truthfully with all of the horror and all of the unfairness of what that history has done to us as a nation, because until we start taking a closer look at this, we will not be able to move towards being one human nation. So I do encourage you, if you have access to the Savannah paper, to really take a look and read that article, because it does talk about something positive going on with a charter school. But that charter school, it has 60 slots available. So you can see we are at a critical mass issue. It's like, how do we get, how to resolve the problem? Do you continue to look at the decline of the public school system? Because I'm not sure if charter schools and private schools in itself is the answer, because we haven't addressed the inflammation. We haven't taken a look at what's really causing the problem. And until we start doing that, and it's not easy, because we have to start looking at our internal culture and our biases, and a lot of those biases are unconscious biases. And what do we need to do individually to really be anti-racism, to break the cycle. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more at the end of the show as we prepare for the caller to call in. I just wanted to give you those thoughts and give you the opportunity to start really kind of looking and peeling the onion. And it's not just, oh, well, I'll get to it someday. And you can, we all have to take care of ourselves and realize wherever we are in our journey, that's where we are. But I would encourage you, I would invite you to really start taking a look at how are we addressing the truth of the history in this country. And I hear the caller calling in, so we're going to take a break and we'll be back with One Human Nation.
Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2. Just want to make sure it's clearer with my headset on. That's what I'm talking now. Or, okay, with the headset on. I can't hear. Two, three. That's 1, 2, 3. And I'll try to talk loud enough. Okay.
Okay, I think we are good to go. So, thank you for joining the One Human Nation show. I know you are traveling. You are a busy lady. So I
Yes,
appreciate
I am.
and it's great that you don't deny that, Pat, because I have some people that, oh no, it's okay, but it's like, but I appreciate you taking the time out in your busy schedule to connect with us. And as you know, we met several weeks ago, and I was just fascinated with the work that you're doing and some of the similarities in our journey with being Gullah-Geechee girls. So, if you can just start by just sharing with us some background information as far as where you grew up, and I thought it was fascinating when we talked as far as how you're spanning the spectrum of history here in our country. But if you can just give us, an idea of your starting out years and how that was for you and where that was for you.
That's glad to, and I go on
So Pat, let me do this one thing because I don't think you're coming over very
Can you hear
clear.
me?
Um, it was kind of like a little echo.
Okay, how about now? Is it better?
Yeah, it is better. Okay. So,
Can you hear me better now?
yeah, we're good to go. So, your early years, what was
We're
that like?
good.
Yes.
Yeah, born and raised in Savannah, uh, in the 50s is what I would say. And I just consider myself a daughter of the dust of the place. I've had a chance to go different places, but my beginnings was I'm number 7 of 10 siblings. My parents had, and uh, uh, I was in second grade. And I didn't love to write and love to read, and at that an American book in our library, it was called out about a dog, and of course I'd read that book about 20 times. So I was fascinated with reading, but I wanted to read something about myself. So my teacher in the second grade gave us an assignment. We're going to study Christopher Columbus. We're having a program on the celebration of his birth and his discovering America. And they said, well, we'll give Pat the long poem because she has a long memory, they said. So they gave me this poem, and it was 4 paragraphs, and 4 stanzas, and I learned it, and I told my teacher, I said, 1472, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I got that, but what did he do? And who discovered anything in 1471? He discovered America in 1472. What was going on in 1471 and backwards? And they never answered. And so in my little second grade mind, I decided that I'm not going to do the poem. I'm going to learn it very well, but the day of the event, I just couldn't do it. And, oh, my goodness. They called my mother. She had to take a taxi cab and all of that. And to make a long story short, I didn't do the poem. I went home. My parents were called in the next day, and they said to them, she's got to leave the school. So they said, well, how many days is she in her? They said, no, she can't go here. She has to be expelled. You have to find another place for her. She asked too many questions. And I think that just stuck with me. And from there, I began to go to the main libraries because at that point, Dr. King had been assassinated in 1968. As I got older and we were able to go into public libraries like the Bull Street Library. We always had Carnegie, but the largest supply of books were in Bull Street.
Yes.
And I began to read and study about African American history. And from that point on, I've been reading and studying and absorbing the African American journey from slavery to freedom in America.
So let me ask you this question.
And it's been a great journey. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, so let me ask you this question. So for elementary school, was your school segregated? Was it predominantly black, or I mean, because I know this was in the 50s, so I don't want to assume that it was segregated, but
yeah.
Okay. So was that
it was segregated.
Okay. And which school was that in Savannah?
Anderson Street Elementary School was the school, in
Okay.
fact.
Okay.
And if you can imagine, our listeners can imagine being a little chocolate girl in the second grade in the late 50s with a segregated school, and then being in first grade in 1963, 64, the President of the United States is killed, and then, 5 years later, Dr. King is killed. It was a very tumultuous time, and here I am in the middle of this saying, I want more books in my library that talk about me. And since I can't get it, I began to go to other places to read about our history.
So, Pat, give us an idea. Growing up in your house, what kind of stories did you hear about race? If any, and sometimes it's not the spoken story, it's the unspoken story. So what messages did you kind of that you felt like you got, even though maybe it wasn't something that your parents actually said, but it was the unsaid, the unspoken?
Let's see. My mom was a wonderful Southern cook, and she reinvented herself over and over. She always talked about being the valedictorian at Dorchester Academy down in Liberty County, but coming to Savannah, the jobs weren't there, so she began to learn how to cook food from all over the world. So she was a specialized caterer in those times. She did Greek food, Italian food, Jewish Passovers, you name it, she did it. So I would enjoy when she would come back from those events and share stories and experiences, and a lot of it had to do with racism. And what she would say is once she worked for this very wealthy woman who was the granddaughter of the co-founders of Coca-Cola here in Savannah. And she'd done a job, and she told them what she was to be paid, and they decided they weren't going to give her that value. And she said to them that, I contracted with you for this particular project, and it's a day's work for a day's pay. And I asked her what that meant, and she said that, my gift is what is providing for us, and I demand to be paid what I am worth, and no matter color, my value is there, and you demand your value. So I got a lot of moral lessons out of that. My dad was a worker at the Savannah Sugar Refinery, and he experienced lots and lots of racism from his supervisors and all of that. And the one thing I learned from his stories was that you must have the strength of character. You must not let anyone break your spirit. You must know who you are. But also a person that would encourage me to read. I became the reader and read and shared with them. And so we took those stories, those experiences, and they shared in stories, and we turned them into moral lessons in living for the rest of our lives. All of my brothers and sisters turned out pretty well, and I think it had a lot to do with them having
So I hate to interrupt, but for some reason I'm getting a little feedback on my end, and I know you're wearing a microphone. I mean a headset. So can you take your headset off for a minute, Pat? Let me see if that's going to correct the problem here.
Okay.
Okay. So. I'm not sure if that's going to be better or not, but let's try it that way for a minute. So, give me an idea on. So, elementary school was segregated. Junior high, was that also segregated?
No, junior high was the beginning of integration.
Okay.
So by the time we got to middle school, we were completely integrated in terms of going into schools that were across town. We got lessons from our teachers that were in those segregated schools. I remember so clearly as we began to go into seventh grade, our teachers that were in those segregated schools also were transferred to some of those schools. And they gave us lessons like, always be respectful, carry yourself with respect and demand respect, and you're going in there to get an education. And one of the things they left with us was that education was empowerment. They kept saying that because they knew that they weren't going to be with us. We didn't have any diagnostics back in those days that said this person is ADD, attention deficit disorder.
Right.
We were all in one classroom and we got lessons. So they basically put that into our hearts that education is empowerment. Go out there and do your work and get your education. They put things in our spirit that, went like, you must, Pat, you have long memory. You must learn to speak well. You must learn the Queen's English. And so I learned the Queen's English very well. But I also realized many, many years later that there's a particular culture in Savannah that doesn't speak the Queen's English well. It's a broken English, they told me. But then I found out that it's not a broken English. It's a Gullah-Geechee. It's a community of people that have been here since the middle of the 1700s with this dialect and this culture and this beauty. So a lot of things that we came into being in Savannah in terms of being raised a certain way, we're discovering new things about it every day, and that was one of the things I learned, that Gullah-Geechee is a community of people that should be celebrated, and our culture should be preserved.
Okay. And I do want to talk more about that, but before we get to that, I do want to ask you a question as far as, then I know high school would have been also then integrated. So from that point, did you stay in Savannah, or after you went through high school, what was your next transition?
After high school, I graduated in the 70s in 76 and was the first runner-up in my high school, Savannah High School, Blue Jacket. Miss Savannah High, I was the first runner-up. And Wolf and Jack was the celebrity at that time that chose it. So it was maybe the second year of that school where we have an African-American, either Miss Savannah High or a runner-up. So that was big news back then.
Right.
I left Savannah High and went on to college in Atlanta at Morris Brown. And from Morris Brown, I went to Georgia State University and graduated there in criminal justice. And from there, I became a paralegal in criminal law and worked in all of the different areas of criminal justice, from juvenile to women in prison to even death row. We've had clients on death row, so I've had 30 years in the criminal justice arena in Atlanta.
So, Pat, I do want to ask you this, and I'm going to take a break while you think about it and stay on the line, because I want to find out, your opinion on the years that you worked in the criminal justice system. What was the impact for you in the connection as far as us not really knowing our history and not understanding the value in our history in the system that you served in? So I'm going to leave you with that question, but stay on the line and we're going to take a break and be right back with you, okay?
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks.
Okay, hold on.
This portion of WRUU-LP Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by a grant from Sentient Bean, offering fair trade coffee, vegan and vegetarian food, and breakfast all day. Located at 13 East Park Avenue, across the street from the tennis courts at Forsyth Park. Our menu and special events listings can be found at sentientbean.com.
WRUU Savannah Soundings Community Radio announces its second annual online auction. The auction will run from July 17th to July 30th, with proceeds going to Savannah Soundings Community Radio as an investment in the diversity of our community voice and music. The wide range of auction items from Savannah businesses will guarantee to delight and surprise. To join the online bidding fun, follow the link found at wruu.org. Okay, Pat, so I'm back with you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So as you were talking about your years in the criminal justice system, because part of this journey and for me internally in taking a look at things that had an impact, it was really everything that I've done previously that kind of got me to this point of realizing why history is important, why going through reconciliation and healing is important, no matter how painful that truth is. So if you can think of, your time in the criminal justice system, is there something that stands out for you of that moment of realizing, wow, we've got to do obviously a better job with how there is this inequity in our system, but did you see any connection to, the hopelessness and the unawareness of, you were an avid learner, you took the time to learn our history. I mean, what was some of your takeaways from being in the criminal justice system?
Well, because I had knowledge of who I was and the history of our African American community, I got a chance to see the criminal justice system from a historical perspective and then try to bring it forward. So, working in the criminal justice system, I was the business manager for the women in prison. I got a chance to work with them and put information into them in terms of how they can identify resources to not come back into the system.
Right.
In terms of juveniles, try to get to the mothers and the parents. But when you get to some areas such as death row, it's permanent. They're going to execute this young man, and there's no process for appeal. So what I thought about, Sandy, was, the history of our country in terms of slavery was that when slaves were freed, and those planters no longer had a population that they could enslave to pick the cotton and all of that, the local sheriff would arrest these men walking down rural town roads, and he would gather them up into their sheriff's department jail and call those planters and say, hey, I've got 25 men in here. Y'all need some work done. And they would pick those guys up, and they began the peonage system. And so when I think about the peonage system in the beginning of the criminal justice system here, and then I have a flashback of General James Oglethorpe and how he convinced the King of England to release the debtors from the prison there and come to a new world, it saddens my heart because we're the only country in the world that has mass incarceration of poor people, both white and black.
Right.
We have to do something better. We have to heal. And then I realized that we really haven't healed from the 1860s when the Civil War was over and we were trying to get ourselves, quote unquote, together. Lincoln was assassinated. We had a Confederate president after that, and we never got a chance to catch up, quote unquote. So the mass incarceration today is a lack of education, the lack of having access to resources, and we have to come up with better plans. And so it saddens me, but it also gives me hope that if we can put together a focus of truth, reconciliation, and healing, we can begin to do something with those that hold the keys to mass incarceration and find better ways to help our people. But it has a historical implication. It's not an accident. It had a history from the founding of Georgia. We let those folks out for their life. And then 15 years of them doing their own work, they went to Africa and got slaves. The rest is history. When do we heal?
Right. Well, and unfortunately, it wasn't only the history in, Georgia. It definitely was throughout the United States. But
Yes.
the fascination for me, especially moving back into Savannah, is really connecting with the Gullah-Geechee history. So if you can explain to our listeners, what does it mean when we refer to the Gullah-Geechee history? How is that defined?
I think it's just Gullah-Geechee communities in terms of people are a celebration of their opportunity to sustain and survive after being in slavery. We're talking about people that came from Angola, so that was the Gullah part of the Angola word, and you're talking about the Gullah-Geechee tribe that came from Liberia. Two tribes of many that came here to plant cotton or to raise up rice, dikes, and all of that. But the Gullah-Geechee community is an official community of 4 states where we still have linkages to our dialect. North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and the northern tip of Florida, Jacksonville area, are identified to have over maybe like 500,000 people that still have that linkage to the Gullah-Geechee folk ways, our dialect, our food ways, and our spirituality. And so you're talking about sea islands where planting was being done on those plantations, and when slavery was over, those people stayed in those sea islands because that's where they made their way after emancipation. And some went to the urban areas, like Savannah would be an urban Gullah-Geechee community versus another area that was rural, but we're all interconnectional. And so the politically correct way that the Gullah-Geechee Commission has put together a description is to say it's interchangeable, Gullah-Geechee. There's no Gullah by themselves, it's Gullah-Geechee. And so we basically put those two together and carry our word. I say to folks, though, Sandy, that if you're in your 60s, as I'm headed toward, and you're talking about the preservation, if we don't preserve the culture with the group that is in their 60s, that is going to be the last group that will celebrate Gullah-Geechee if we don't continue to preserve the culture. Our elders are dying, and we know in the Gullah-Geechee community that when an elder dies, we lose an entire library.
Right.
So we're the next generation up. So our work is to try to preserve the culture in terms of the ways that we live, the ways that we pray, and the ways that we heal.
I think that's a good description, and that's exactly what I experienced in coming back to Savannah, just in the area that I grew up in, and researching the history of that particular area. And when I connected with you, I just thought it was fascinating, the work that you were doing and the research you were doing and pulling together this initiative. So if you want to talk about that in a little bit more detail so that we have a clear picture of, what have you been doing to preserve that history of the Gullah-Geechee?
Well, one of the things that I think with our piece is we've been preserving our buildings. We don't have very many praise houses left on the Georgia side. So the praise houses were those first houses after slavery where we had church services, and then the next day it turned into a school. It's usually a big one room, a door in the center and a door in the back, sort of like a shotgun house, but a larger version. Okay. And so we look around to try to preserve those buildings. We try to preserve the churches that are over 100 years old. I have a church here in Savannah, First African Baptist Church, in fact, that have tongue and groove pews that were made by the slaves in the 1700s. They are still here, and people sit on them for Bible study every Wednesday night.
Right.
So our education process is we don't want you to sit on a pew from the 1700s. We want to educate our churches and communities to preserve it. It needs to be in a museum.
Right.
Celebrated. So preservation is one way. We try to preserve our food ways. We try to catalog ceremonies in terms of weddings and funerals. There are still funerals that go on in Savannah, in the Georgia side, where if a child is there in the cemetery when a person is buried, the child is lifted over the coffin as it goes down 6 feet deep. And the connotation is that if you don't take the child and transfer it over the body, the particular elder that's passing on will enter the child's spirit, and the child will become that elder. Now, that's just a way they practice. That's a Gullah-Geechee folk way.
Right.
So we try to preserve these things and make sure that people not make mockery of it. It's not voodoo. It's not any of that. It's the folk ways that we've been journeying with for the past, since 1619.
Right. So I think this is a good point, a good place for you to mention or let us know if we wanted to get connected with any of the tours that you were doing. What's the best way to do that? Is there a website?
Yes, there is. We have 6 different tours, and our daily tour is called Slaves in the City. We have an abolitionist tour. We have an African-American ghost tour. We have a Gullah-Geechee talking tour. So our website where you can find all of this wonderful information is www.undergroundtours with an S of Savannah.com.
Okay.
Undergroundtoursofsavannah.com.
Okay. And do you have, so you do these every day? Did you mention one particular, which particular one do you do every day?
We do the ghost tours every day,
Okay.
by request. And then the other tours we do Tuesday through Saturday,
Okay.
3 times a day, 10 o'clock in the morning, 1 o'clock, and 3 p.m. is our last tour.
Okay.
They get a chance to have a storyteller that speaks in Gullah-Geechee dialect as the tour guide. I'm one of those tour guides. Gullah Mike is one of them. And we also have surprises along the way. We'll have a reenactor that will show up. So
Okay.
It's a wonderful tour, and we'd love you to come down.
Okay. And would this be a good time for you to kind of give us a short kind of preview, a short story in the Gullah-Geechee dialect, for want of a better way to put it, so that our listeners can hear what that sounds like?
One of my favorite groups is Sweet Honey in the Rock, and they were one of the groups that sang with Dr. King on the marches in the 60s.
Right.
And they have a song that they sing, and the story that goes along with it is a story from the Gullah-Geechee community. And it's a story about Molly. And Molly is a freed slave that is on her own land now. Bring me a little water, Molly. Bring me a little water, child. Bring me a little water, Molly. Fast as you can. Molly, come right, bucket in a hand. I need a little bit of water every little once in a while. Bring me a little water, Molly. Bring me a little water, child. I need a little water every little once in a while. Ashe-o, ashe-o, ashe-o.
That's great. I love it. Thank you for sharing that with us. And it, to me, it just brings back some memories of things that I really didn't even know existed in the community where I grew up. I didn't know we would have been the more, I guess, the rural here in Savannah, because where I grew up, it was actually dirt roads, and it wasn't in the city, it was in the county. But it was such a tight-knit community where, the kind of things that as a child I think drove me crazy, because, before, if you got into trouble, your parents knew it before they even got home, so,
that's right. Yeah.
It really, kind of, you wonder, how did they know that? But it was just a totally different time. And I think it was a wonderful time, and I think that's part of what's missing in our culture today, is that there's a disconnect from community. There's a disconnect from not knowing our history. And what I talk to the listeners about is, it's not only a Black history or a white history or Native American history or Asian American history. It's our history. It's, taking the time to learn the truth of our history. And, you mentioned it at the beginning when you talked about, you were at a young age supposed to tell the story of, Christopher Columbus. And I've mentioned on one of the previous shows is I still don't understand. And I guess it just speaks to why we're so far off on reconciliation. Why is this still a holiday? Why are we still celebrating something that we know is not true? So part of the truth is really addressing the truth. And I think the disconnect, with the children coming up is that they're exposed to so much information. They know it's not the truth. I mean, you knew it wasn't the truth even at your age, and you did not have the exposure to everything that they have now as far as social media and Twitter and this and not to mention what comes on the TV now. I mean, and I can remember we had black and white TV, and we only had 3 or 4 stations, and I know some parents still do this as far as limiting access to, when their kids even can watch TV, but it's not, the norm, whereas that's just the way it was. It wasn't a choice. That was just where we were with our technology at the time. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, I just wanted to concur. I mean, it's like, we knew something was wrong then, even as children, but now today's society, young folks have all these resources and tools all around them. They can simply Google something and find out, or they can research it with the touch of a button on their phone.
Yes, and I do think that's one of the reasons why, and I'm not sure if you listened to the beginning of the show where I was talking about the article that was in Sunday's paper and referencing the Lost Boys of Savannah. And, maybe, and I don't know, this may have happened during the time you were not back in Savannah, because I was trying, and I'm still pulling together what happened with some of the public housing projects in Savannah. And this particular one was where these boys lived, was the old Hitch Village public housing project. And so, but it goes on to talk about, what they witnessed at a very young age, and then fast forward to their adult years where, to being indicted for murder, and the other being accused of possession of a controlled substance. And, I know it in some ways may sound simplistic and go, really, Sandy, you mean to tell me if we just all embraced our history, we would be better and things would be better? It is more than that, because it's not only the history of the country, it's our internal history. So I want to ask you, part of your journey internally, what was the turning point for you to make that break? And you may still be involved with the criminal justice system, but what was that point for you that you made that shift in focusing on the preservation of history as being extremely important?
It was so clear. It was 1985, Sandy. I witnessed the execution of a mentally retarded young man, Jerome Alden. He was 25 years old. He was the accessory to the murder, but because he didn't have money, the person who killed a guy got life and Jerome got death. That's what was happening back in 1985. In 1985, they were executing mentally retarded, which was the description at that time, mentally retarded, and they were executing juvenile. And I had the mispleasure of having to witness the execution for the family members. And he was mentally retarded and was with someone, but he grew up in a dirt poor community. After that execution, I couldn't do criminal justice practice any longer, and I decided to go to the other end. I basically had like a premonition. It's like, what can I do that doesn't feel like this? And my conclusion was that I should do art and culture. Came back to Savannah and started representing farmers, black farmers, and getting them contracts with the government. Got lost in a rural town, asked the young lady for directions, and she gave me directions with her hand over her mouth, and she had this distinct dialect. And I asked her, "Why do you cover your mouth?" She said, "Because I speak a broken English." And that's when I started discovering, like Zora Neale Hurston, that this is a particular language with a particular tongue, but it's nothing to be looked down on.
Right.
And then I realized that art and culture is what makes people feel better. It's the first thing that gets cut from the budgets, but it's the thing that makes people feel better. The young people don't know who they are. They don't have a history. We're not supposed to stay in public housing for 6 generations.
Right.
That was supposed to be temporary. So, I can't have a bleeding heart. I just have to have an abolitionist heart to say, what can we do to prevent the other young men and women from having that type of mindset that they can take someone's life that
Right.
it doesn't have any value. It comes from history, and it comes from, like you said, an internal instinct that it's wrong. I also want to say, we have to just try to make our marks while we're here, because I know now, Harriet Tubman is being celebrated all over the United States and the world, and she's like a celebrity now, post-celebrity. She made her mark, and now people are catching up to her mark 153 years later. So we just have to do what we can to make our marks now. But I can tell you that the young people, as well as the older people in terms of elders and intergenerational, should get together and what we call sit with each other. They should sit and talk
Right.
around breaking bread or whatever, but they need to sit, because when you can sit, you can listen and learn and share, and maybe we can begin to come up with some solutions to this. But I agree with you 100%. It has to be internal. It has to be an instinct of right and wrong.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And believe it or not, I know I told you before we went on the air that time's going to go pretty quickly, and it has.
Yeah, it has. Oh, wow.
It has. And so, yeah, it's been awesome. And I will keep the doors open, as we say. So you have an open door to come back and share more with us as we continue on this journey. And so if you can leave us again with the website address of how the listeners can connect with you, that would be great.
Thank you. The website is www.undergroundtoursofsavannah.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Pat, for taking time out of your schedule to share your insights and your stories with us. And I know we will be connecting in the very near future. Is there anything you want to leave with us in parting share with us before we part ways today?
It's been a pleasure, Sandy. I've enjoyed every moment of it. And I just want to share with your listeners that you all have stories inside of you, as well as your family members. When someone begins to tell a story, I need you to take those fancy phones and press record.
Exactly.
You remember what I said. If an elder leaves us, they leave a library. You are now creating your own library. Press record. Get those stories down. They're priceless.
Thank you so much, Pat. And you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'll be talking to you soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye. So as we come to the end of today's show, thank you for listening to Pat sharing information, some of it very pertinent to Savannah, some of it very pertinent to the whole Gullah-Geechee history. But what I want to encourage you to do in your community, wherever you are in the United States, is to start learning about the history. Because what I'm finding is that there are some hidden stories that, are being forgotten or trying to be erased. And we can't erase our history. I look at other countries that have already embraced the atrocities that occurred in their nation. So if you think of Germany with the Holocaust, I mean, you can't go to Germany and not be aware of what happened. And they don't want to ever forget what happened. When you go to South Africa and with apartheid, they reckon that they're reconciled to what they did. They accept the truth of what they did, and reconciliation does not mean agreement. It means that we have to be aware and awake to the truth of what what that truth is. And when you look at Australia, the same thing with the indigenous people that were there, the Aborigines that were there, they have embraced in Australia what they've done, and it's still a lasting legacy. It's not something just because we have reconciliation that the problems go away. It just means that we can now move forward and start healing. But if we continue to be in denial, then we can never heal. And if we cannot heal, we cannot get to justice. So on that note, I will leave you with the thought of the top of the hour coming up with Troy Stoner in Sound Limits. Thank you so much for listening to One Human Nation.